Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Well, Halloween is almost upon us, and with it comes that chilling paradox of running away while we run to the horror. How is it that is even possible, that we are fearful yet fascinated by the very thing that haunts us, the unspeakable? Maybe for you, it's ghosts or haunted houses. For someone else, it might be zombies or vampires. Or maybe there's something deeper, even darker, that frightens you. A haunting that you can't run away from, even in the light of day or even while you sleep. Here to talk about what haunts us is someone who's thought a lot about it as a writer and teacher. Suzette Mayr is the award-winning author of 6 novels, including The Sleeping Car Porter, which won the Giller Prize last year. She's also a professor of English at the University of Calgary, and she joins us. Hi, Suzette.
Hello. I can't wait to talk today.
I know. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Okay, right off the bat, tell me why you believe in ghosts.
Because my mother said they exist, basically. Let's just be frank. I've never seen a ghost, but that doesn't mean anything. I think it's partly because of my Caribbean heritage in a way. My mother's from the Bahamas, and I think there's just a different kind of understanding of the supernatural versus the real within certain cultures. And so, for example, you can dream, you can have premonitory dreams. You can predict the future with some dreams, for example. And I remember her specifically talking about when we moved into this older house, when I was about 19. And she said, I saw a woman looking out the window, but don't worry about it. She's friendly. And then the clincher for me was my brother, who's like a very practical, he's a very practical minded guy. He's just, there's nothing vaguely woo woo about him. And he said that he saw a woman on the second floor of our house and she was wearing a long dress. And so I thought, okay, well, if he says it and my mother says it, well, then it must be real. But, I'm fascinated by that idea that, we don't know that much about our brains and that there's a lot going on around us that we maybe don't apprehend, that we don't understand. And it's partly, also the writer in me, which is, there's got to be more to it than this, really, than the real that we see. There's got to be more to it than that. And I know there's more to it than that. There are all kinds of strange coincidences and, I don't know. There's strangeness that we can't actually explain. I remember, being at a talk of elders at the University of Calgary, Indigenous elders, and one of them was a mathematician. And he, I've always thought of math as one of the most precise kinds of disciplines where there's nothing unknown. But he said that there is a segment of math where you kind of just math yourself out. You can't actually math into it. It's like unknown math. And I'm like, whoa, that's awesome. It becomes kind of like, I don't know. For me, I read it as supernatural, but that's just how I roll.
Yeah, what I find interesting too, well, 2 things you said. One, the cultural influence that you experienced, being influenced by the Caribbean culture. And so does that mean that the possibility of supernatural, of maybe things like ghosts, it's more normalized? Like it's just something you kind of accept and live with?
I think so. I think that's what it is. I mean, I haven't had that much experience with it. We don't visit that part of the family very much, but that's my understanding of it. And I think it also comes from, and I've talked about this in other interviews, that, my mother, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother died when my mother was 18 and her father died when my mother was 15. And so she was orphaned at the age of 18. She lost both parents. And I would say that there was a palpable absence in our household of those grandparents parents, or specifically of my grandmother. And we kind of grew up with that. And my mother would dream of her mother, and her mother would warn her of, oh, the garage, something bad is going to happen. And then the next day the garage door would fall. Or my mother dreamed that, she dreamed that I was queer. And so asked me, are you kissing girls? And it's like, yes. How did you know that? I dreamed it, and I'm like, God damn it. But, I honestly, I think that the dead leave residue behind, whether it's just, if you want to rationalize it, maybe it's just in our memories, maybe it's in the artifacts they leave behind, but they're with us all the time. And I think within this culture, Canadian culture, North American culture, there's this real kind of division between the dead and the living that I think is a little bit artificial and doesn't do much good for anyone, really. Doesn't help with grief.
Yeah. Well, I also was reading that, and I don't know if you're doing this now, but that you did or you are teaching a course on haunted houses. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I read it. I taught a course on haunted house literature, and also my PhD thesis was a novel, which became Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Carley Hall. But part of that was like 120-page exploration of sentient house literature in Canadian and Australian literature. So,
yeah. I love the fact that you talk about, the different kinds of haunted houses. Can you just explain that to us?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple different kinds of haunted houses. There's the haunted house, which is a building that has, it's just an inanimate object and it got ghosts in it. And then there's the sentient house, which is the house that itself is an organism. And the creepiness, the uncanniness comes from the fact that the house is neither animal nor vegetable nor inanimate object. And so the best examples of that would be, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which opens about a house that has gone insane. And there's no explanation for why the house is as it is. And that's what I love, because quite often in those other books with the house as an inanimate object is just basically a vessel for ghosts. It's because somebody has died. Often there are those really insidious stereotypical tropes of, we're on an Indigenous burial ground or whatever. Whereas with sentient houses, there's no explanation. And I think one of the first examples of that would have been Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, because in that story, Poe talks about, or the narrator talks about, how there's something in the collocation of the stones of the house. So there's something inherently wrong in the house itself that is the problem. And I'm fascinated by that.
Okay, so I've got to tell you this story then. And this is a good story about, I guess, I don't know, would it be a sentient house? So I have a friend, and she is an architect. Well, she was a professor of architecture. So she's really into homes. And she said that depending on the house, and it doesn't happen that often, but she has walked into a house, typically a very old house, and immediately she will get a feeling and almost hear a sound. It's like the house is emitting a sound. She said it's kind of like this tinkle, like a little bell or something. And she's actually experienced this. What does that sound like to you? I mean, does that sound wild or?
No. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a photographer for realtors, and she and the realtor, there were always certain houses where whoever lived in that house, it was not going to go well for them. Like literally it was to the point where Sue would come with her camera and the realtor would come in, and they'd go into the house and Sue would ask the realtor, so who's moving in? And the realtor would say, oh, this young couple. And they'd both go, oh, that relationship's not going to last, because relationships in this house never last. It reminds me a little bit of, how there are certain corners where stores or businesses just never thrive.
Yes.
Or what was super fascinating to me, it's awful, but it's fascinating to me, the whole phenomenon of sick buildings. So there was a building in Australia that housed the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And there was a whole, 16 women came down with breast cancer in that building. And they did test after test after test, and there was no indication of any kind of terrible chemical. And then when I think the 17th woman got breast cancer, they just everybody evacuated the building and they never used the building again. And it got torn down and now is condos or something like that. But there are some buildings there where there's something wrong. And who knows, maybe it's chemical, maybe it's, maybe for your friend, she's got ultrasonic hearing. I don't know, but I think it's kind of, there are some things that are not explainable, right?
Yeah.
Why? And there's no scientific explanation. I think that's lovely that she goes in and there's a kind of tinkle. That's
Well,
super
do you know what?
interesting.
The last time that happened to her, it was so strong, she bought the house. She wasn't planning on buying a house, but she bought it.
Wow. And so does
Yeah.
the tinkle continue to this day?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'll have to ask her that. I have not asked her. You know what? I'm wondering whether I don't know if it did, because she actually disassembled. It was a very old house and it was going to be torn down. And she wanted to save it because she had this strong connection. And so she disassembled the whole thing and rebuilt it. So I wonder if the tinkle still stayed. I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
You have to ask her.
Okay, I will.
Let me know.
But I was thinking about what with you as a writer too. I mean, haunted houses, they can be such a great metaphor for so many things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, often, in most, like in haunted house literature that I've read, so mostly fiction, it's usually about the vulnerability or the haunting of a person, so you'll find often in horror literature where the protagonist has lost something vital to themselves, like maybe they've lost a spouse or they've lost a child or something traumatic has happened to them. And the house accesses that vulnerability and worms itself in there and in that way tries to destroy the protagonist. But I've also, especially when I was doing my PhD and looking at Canadian and Australian nationhood, it was about the whole idea of uncanny nation, and uncanny for whom. So it was hugely compelling for me to think that, or to realize that when you look at Australian literature, for example, there aren't so many haunted houses or sentient houses, but there is haunted land. So vast stretches of land where it's vibey, where things happen. So there's a stretch of highway that, where it started out with like a massacre of Indigenous people, and then a serial killer took over that road and people die in terrible accidents. So it's the land that's bad. And in Canada, you also don't find, I think there's more and more of a tradition, literary tradition that's developing even now of sentient and haunted house literature, but not as much. And I kind of dove deep into this whole idea of uncanny spaces, but uncanny for whom, so it's interesting that on one hand, you'll have a Stephen King kind of story where it's like, oh, it's sacred Indigenous ground. But for some Indigenous writers, actually, no, the haunting is the settlers and the invaders, so, there's a playwright, Daniel David Moses, who wrote a play called Big Buck City. And it's about this Indigenous couple of, of Indigenous heritage who move into a white neighborhood, a suburban neighborhood, and they're trying to fit in, but that kind of microaggressive, racism is hitting them all the time. And it manifests as a haunting of the house. Like the house is just, there's something inherently wrong with the house. So so it can go from as small as, this is the psychological thing happening to an individual to, this is the nation or this is the planet or whatever,
and that also plays with the whole concept of home.
Yeah.
What is home?
Exactly. What is home? Absolutely. I think Rita Wong talks about, how Canada is haunted by the Japanese internment or whatever, but it's also about the displacement of people, the leaving of their artifacts, the residues left behind. The whole scary thing about haunted houses is that home is supposed to be your safe space. And Stephen King talks about it in Danse Macabre, where he says, that's where you go. When you go home, that's when you take off all your armor and that's when you are yourself. But if something infiltrates that space, then you're in deep trouble because there's nowhere to go. And that's what's scary, is when there's nowhere to go. Or, people who are home for you. I've seen also where, in a couple of movies where people have, the filmmakers have constructed or represented dementia, for example, as a kind of haunting or possession, where the person, your grandmother, your mother, yourself, you know them so fundamentally, but they're starting to change and you don't know who that person is anymore. And there's a lovely Australian movie that came out. I can't remember the title, where it's about a woman and her daughter who go to take care of the grandmother. And the grandmother is clearly not doing well. And then, the house starts changing and it's got rooms that they can't get out of and basements and this and an extra floor. And it turns out it's kind of a metaphorical representation of what's happening to the grandmother in terms of, how dementia is taking her away from the family and the experience of dementia. It's really fascinating.
So wait a minute. So in that case, then, who's actually being haunted? Is it the
Good.
grandmother or the
or all of them?
Yeah. Oh, that really brings up. Yeah. I mean, because, I was thinking about home, and absolutely, like, where do you go to if you can't go home?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also the home of your mind where you can find solace, right?
Yeah.
And if you are perpetually haunted by your mind, by something that is, in your mind, where you can't go anywhere. There's nowhere. You can't flee. You know what I mean? Because you're there always.
Yeah. So often those narratives are about having to face that haunting full on. What is it? How do you get rid of it? Often it's a metaphor for grief, for unresolved, whatever kinds of conflicts or internal struggles. They're often quite psychologically based, these stories.
Yeah. Well, okay. I don't know about you, but for me, those are the worst. Like, those are the scariest. The the ghosts and the, I don't know, whatever, the bloody axe murder and all that. Okay. Yeah, that's scary. But for me, it's mental.
Yes. Oh, I totally agree. Especially, because with a slasher, a slasher flick or book, it's like, okay, if you can beat that guy with the axe, okay, you're fine. But with possession, it's, what's scariest to me is an angry woman. You know what I mean? Like an angry female ghost, because women don't get angry. They're not supposed to get angry. So when you see one who's coming out of a well and wants to kill you, you're in trouble. Like, you're not getting away from that. Or a little kid, it's like you're in deep, deep trouble. Deep trouble.
Oh gosh, I never thought. So an angry kid, I find that scary because it's the whole dichotomy of innocence and evil, right?
Yeah.
That would be an angry baby, even worse.
An angry baby.
A giant angry baby.
Yeah. Oh, there's that zombie baby in the remake of Dawn of the Dead who's like, what? You could run away, I guess, but it'll come crawling.
Well, it's because this interview, it really made me think about what haunts me. What do I find really scary? And for me, I think it came down to two things. And one was, and again, it would involve childhood. When I read a story or see a movie where something terrible, like something so traumatic happens to a child, and then it haunts that child for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
You agree. Is that scary? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one, because their innocence is taken away. And the other one is, and I guess this is also to do with what you said earlier about the dementia or something happening to your mind. It's when you're totally isolated, like either physically or even worse, mentally. So it's one of those movies where you're trying to convince people around you, but this really happened. Like, this is the story, and no one believes you.
Yeah.
Like, nobody believes you. So it's like everyone else is insane. You think you're sane, but then they think you're insane.
Yeah.
Oh, I find that petrifying.
Yeah. That's basically the plot of The Haunting of Hill House. There's a character named Eleanor Vance and nobody believes her. And in the meantime, where something held her hand in the middle of the night, on the walls, it says, Eleanor, come home. Somebody's written that, but they all think, well, you must have written that, for example, Yeah.
The other thing too, I want to ask you is, do you think that whole paradox that I talked about in the introduction, the running away, but the running to, right? Of whatever it is that's on speak, but like, well, first of all, why do you think, why would we not just run away?
Run away from the haunted house?
Well, yeah. or run away from anything that is scary to us. But, we're like this. We're like, right? We're peeking through our fingers. Like we don't want to look, but we're going to look. But,
Oh, okay.
or
So
we're
are
going
you
to,
talking about the audience or the viewer, or are you talking about the
yeah.
characters in the book?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm talking about us. Like,
Oh,
yeah. What is it?
I've heard that it's cathartic. It's like living vicariously through, like seeing that horror, but knowing, okay, I'm safe at home. And it's about a release of that emotion and a kind of rehearsal for actual horror. That's what I've heard. That's one theory. And I suspect that in certain cultures that are severely traumatized, that are being at war or whatever, probably people aren't watching horror movies because their lives are horror movies. But I find it cathartic. And I also, often a lot of these stories, they appeal to me in a huge way because they're often about the return of the repressed. They're the angry woman. They're about the creature. And often I tend to identify with the monster rather than with the people who are being terrorized. You know what I mean? Because often when you talk about what's horrible, it's things that are dark. It's things that are unresolved. It can be an entire group of people who are seen as the scary thing. But if you maybe belong to a group of people who are considered the scary thing, then it becomes a different kind of narrative. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make, okay. You just totally, it's like, whoop, a 180. If that's the case, I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. Yeah. What if you are the other?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You're the other. Then doesn't that completely change how you view horror literature? What's scary? Right?
Oh, yeah. It's completely different. It's a completely different way of looking at the text.
Talk about that. That's really interesting.
Well, I just recently read an article where the writer was talking about The Ring, the movie The Ring, which is, I don't know if
you mean the original Japanese one?
The Japanese one and also the American remake.
Okay.
I think they were mostly talking about the American remake.
Okay.
And they were talking about the little girl, Samara, as actually in terms of disability and how she had been marginalized as somebody with a mental illness and mistreated as a result of her mental illness. And so they're coming at it from the subject position of being a person with a disability. And so they're reading the story completely differently. And
oh, sorry. Let me just stop for people who aren't familiar with The Ring. So that interpretation, whereas what the mainstream interpretation would be of Samara.
The mainstream interpretation is, little girls are scary and she was the devil and that's why she got killed. And so her coming back is terrible for everyone. Whereas with this particular interpretation, it's kind of like, well, wait a second. How was this kid treated? And so is she not maybe justified in being a little bit pissed off about the way she was treated? I also think about the reason Get Out, that Jordan Peele movie, was so potent was because I would say it's undermining or it's definitely unpacking or questioning that whole narrative of blackness and darkness as the evil, and instead looking at a different kind of construction of evil.
Okay, again, explain for people who aren't familiar. I did see that movie.
Sure, yeah. So Get Out is about a guy, a black guy who marries into a white family. So he's this white, beautiful, I'm not sure if they're married or if she's just the fiance.
Yeah, the fiance.
I don't want to spoil him, but whatever. Anyway, I'll spoil it. So he marries into this family. It's a white, wealthy family. And it turns out that the family, and there are no other people of color in that family. And it turns out that the family actually, takes over or steals the souls of the black people, so that they can live forever. And so he's just kind of trying to fight being taken over and having his head sawn in half so that a white guy can put his brain in his head, basically. And, in a way, it's sort of a narrative about ultimately that, interracial relationships will kill you. I mean, that's the sort of sad subtext of all of this. But it's also, it's lovely because rather than the black man being the object of terror, it's actually the white family that's the object of terror. And that's really interesting to me.
Geez, I didn't take away the whole interracial relationships will kill you thing.
That's kind of what it
What
says, right? Like that's
is
the
that?
thing about horror is that horror,
Yeah,
it's sometimes it can be symptomatic, sometimes it can be subversive. And I think in this case, it's symptomatic in that it's kind of underlining that, well, if you get into an interracial relationship, this is what can happen to you. Whereas other kinds of horror, it will be, no, let's just blow up the whole package and the white woman and the black
huh.
man run away and are happy for the
Yeah,
rest of their
yeah.
lives, maybe.
You know what? I like this subversion, absolutely, that the black man was the victim. And I guess I took it more on a larger scale of, white people feeding off the
Yeah.
blacks.
Oh,
That
that of
that's sort of,
course.
yeah, that's really what I got.
Oh, for
Yeah,
sure. That's
yeah,
absolutely there as
yeah.
well. That's the lovely thing about all of these stories is that you can interpret them in all kinds of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I love that film. It was unsettling. It's so I and it was funny. Like it was funny,
It
but it
was
was also
funny.
yeah, unsettling. I love the whole, turning it around on its, on its head. Um, and just as you say, like the person who's normally the predator or the monster now becomes the victim.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's what you were
Exactly.
talking about seeing horror in a different way.
Yeah. Well, and zombie movies, where does that come
Yeah.
from? It comes from, that whole twisting of the whole idea of voodoo or obia. So this cultural, spiritual practice and twisting it so that it becomes something other and scary and terrible. So you take revenants or zombies, and they become this thing of evil. Whereas when you think about the origins of voodoo or obia, that's like it's a religious practice that belongs to a particular group of people. It's not a scary thing. It's what it is. But
Mhm.
when you look at dominant North American culture, movie culture, horror culture, it's like, that's terrifying because it's other and it's strange and therefore evil.
Just I'm thinking too, going back to what you said about um the fear fascination thing and that whole experience of watching something scary is cathartic.
Mm,
Um, but you said that maybe people who actually have been through horror may not want to watch horror, right? Because they're living it or they've lived it.
I wonder. I
I
don't,
wonder,
yeah.
yeah, because I know when I see something scary, like I feel like all my senses, maybe it's the whole like my flee response is at its height, even though
Yeah.
there's nothing really scary. I'm just watching something, but right? My pulse starts going, I'm breathing rapidly, I'm watching this. Do you think also we need some of that if we don't have like real imminent horror in our lives because it makes us feel alive?
Yeah, I would say so. It's also, yeah, I think it's also about, it does make us feel alive. It's also entertainment. And I think entertainment is essential to living. It reminds me a little bit of, I have a colleague, Anthony Camara, who talks about how there's kind of eco horror coming up. And what's interesting about eco
Ah.
horror is that it decenters humans or human animals as being at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the triangle, and instead is about nature. Nature deciding, you know what, I don't care about you at all, and becoming the protagonist of that story. And that's what's scary is suddenly humans are no longer in control. I don't know. I think it's also about lessons. It's,
Well, were we ever though? I mean, really, were
yeah,
we
well,
ever?
no, we weren't, but we sure like to think we are,
Yeah.
right? We
Yeah.
sure like to think we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we fooled ourselves into thinking we are.
Yeah. And now we're in deep trouble. We should have
Yeah.
paid attention to Frankenstein. That book, it predicted the future, predicted the future.
Well, and the other thing I wanted to ask you is, there seems to be such a preoccupation now with true crime stories,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
whether it's literature, I just go to the bookstore and all the bestsellers, most of them seem to be true crime. And the podcasts that are out there that people are, and the movies, right? Why do you think it is so popular today?
I have no idea. I have no idea. And I say this as somebody who's like a sometime consumer of those stories. I remember reading somewhere where some scientist or behavioral psychologist was trying to explain why when there's like a terrible accident, there are people who are like rubberneckers and gawkers who will drive by slowly.
Yeah.
And I think their theory was that by doing that, it's not just out of pure interest. It's okay, you looking at it and figuring out, okay, if that ever happens to me, that's what I'm not going to do. So this is okay. So if this situation reoccurs, what should so it's about learning. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
I think, I think people there's a fascination. There's this is me just pie in the sky. I have no idea. And I'm so not educated in this, but I wonder if, there's such a divide now between the rich and the poor, the rich and the working classes, the rich and it's massive now. You've got the billionaires on one side and then other people who can't afford craft dinner. And it seems to me that at least the true crime stories I'm interested in are the ones that have to do with wealthy families who are falling apart. That there's like this facade and then there's the Murdoch murders, for example.
No, that is interesting what you say. Well, the mighty have fallen. Like there is that theme. There could be that theme. I almost think too, with true crime, there's often innocents, right, who are involved in true crime. And I feel as if that's people feel in many ways that they have been victimized. That things happen to them, right? Terrible things that they really had no control over. They weren't the bad person in this scenario, but bad stuff happened to them. I don't know. Like, who knows? Yeah, like me too. I'm just speculating.
Who knows?
Okay, I want to know though. What to you is the scariest book you've ever read?
The scariest book I ever read.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I don't know, maybe it kept you up at night or nights. Stayed with you.
I want to say this is maybe an odd answer, but I thought Jane Eyre was kind of terrifying because it's about this young woman who gets hired as a governess. She's, got no other options. She's hired as a governess in this old house with these children and this mysterious guy, Rochester, and it's a haunted house as far as she knows, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a woman in the attic. There's the woman in the attic, Bertha Mason, who it turns out is the first wife that Rochester is trying to just pretend she doesn't exist. And I find that psychologically just so twisted and terrible, just terrible because it's, she has no option but to live in this house. And the woman upstairs is maybe her shadow self. And then what I love about that book is that Jean Rhys years later wrote Wide Sargasso Sea from the perspective of the woman in the attic. And it turns out that she's actually a Caribbean heiress who, Rochester just takes advantage of. And then when she is no longer of any use to him, he locks her in the attic. So I think it's a particularly scary, Jane Eyre is particularly scary to me because it's about women having no choices. They've got no choices and they can see what the end will be. But as far as scary movies, I'm far more scared by movies, I think, because I don't have control over the imagery. But The Ring damaged me psychologically for years.
Oh, no, really?
Well, in a good, terrible way, right? Because of the little girl and you can't see her face. You never see her face. And so my imagination just worked overtime because I'm like, well, what does her face look like? And maybe that's actually the back of her head and her head was put on backwards. And there's that scene where she crawls out of the well. And I heard that the filmmaker, what he did was actually film it so that the actor who's playing the little girl, Samara, is actually crawling. In real life, she was crawling backwards into the well, but then he made it so that the film is going. So she's coming out forwards, but it's actually backwards.
I get it,
and so that's why it's all kind of weird. She's moving weird. So, the fact that it's this kid crawling out of I hate water. This little kid, I can't stand it when little kids are treated badly, and she's coming to get you and you're in trouble and it's a little kid. So, you're in deep trouble because little kids can be they're going to fight dirty. They don't care about the rules.
I
There's
am
no.
never going to watch that movie now.
It's
I
excellent.
am
You've
never.
gotta watch
No,
it. You've gotta see it.
no,
Oh,
you
it's
know
so
what?
good.
Well, I'll tell you. So many people have said to me, it is so good, but it's so bad. That's why it's so good. That's why I don't
Yeah.
want to watch it.
You know what? Watch it like this. Watch it
Yeah.
like this, and then just do
You're
this
looking
every
through
so
your
often.
fingers.
Yeah.
Do you know what too? I want to touch again about something you said about horror and home and it could be perception of the land, right? And the
Yeah.
horror of what's happened to our land. How do you feel about our perception of horror changing, with the times, depending on what's going on in society, right? What's going on politically, socially? What about those horrors, right? I'd like your sort of take on how the external, like, environment, so whether it's politics, whether it's social movements, etc., can permeate our literature and our concept of horror and what haunts us.
Yeah. Um, So one example I can think of is if you look at quite a few of the haunted house books, like Amityville Horror, a couple of others, they often start, and Burnt Offerings, I think. So older books for sure. They're often about people who are trying to buy their way out of their class. So they
Oh.
buy a house they can't afford. They buy a house in a neighborhood where they don't quite belong. And it's kind of a smackdown of those people that, who do you think you are, trying to be something other than what you are? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So the Amityville Horror family, they can't afford that house, or they can't afford that neighborhood. And the house is super cheap. So they're going to move in there. And of course, what happens, I think it's once again this kind of example of horror as kind of, in a way, it's subversive, but on the other hand, it's also kind of about reinforcing the status quo, which is stay in your place, for example.
Well, you know what? I mean, that I did think about your novel too. The main character, Baxter, he wants more than what he is. Like,
Yeah.
what and 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 he's got things that haunt him, like, all through the book.
Yeah, it's true.
Can you talk about that? I mean,
Yeah. So the main character is held in place because of his race, because of his sexuality. He has very little chance of any kind of mobility from this very subservient job.
mhm.
And his only way of getting away, the only routes he has available are, either just finding a whole hunk of money and a magic world where he can buy his way out of this job and become the dentist he wants to be, or resort to his imagination. And he finds comfort in basically horror stories and speculative fiction because they're places of, they are kind of, spaces of freedom and of hope. Really, horror is about hope for him that, the oppressed shall overcome. And the whole brotherhood of sleeping car porters, that was all about union people mobilizing to form unions and get better labor rights, and disrupt the status quo. And he's living the conditions that led to porters deciding, you know what, we've had enough. We need to be treated like humans who need
Yeah.
sleep and food and respect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for me, you really opened a window into that world I knew nothing about. Because you're following his every movement over a few days, the course of a few days when he's on a train, right, going out
Mm-hmm.
west. And I always felt like, for me, because his existence is so precarious, I was always on the edge, just like he was. No, right? Because he's not sleeping. He's not getting enough sleep. He's like within an inch of getting fired and losing his job. And then all his dreams are dashed to becoming a dentist. So it's like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, you're standing on the edge. That's
Yeah.
horror.
It, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
The horror.
scary. That's scary.
Yeah, that is scary. And him losing his job means he loses his livelihood, which means that his survival is at stake. And I think that is really scary for a lot of people. And why they can't get out of the conditions they're in is because they can't afford it. They can't lose their jobs, and so they're stuck. They're stuck in these terrible jobs or terrible situations. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that book started out way more supernatural than it actually ended up. Like, one of the compartments was supposed to be a haunted one.
Oh.
And so he would not only have to deal with these horrible passengers, but also with this, with ghosts as well. And it just got out of control and became two completely different stories. So maybe that's the sequel is, okay, actually the train is haunted, and that's a whole other,
Well, you
who
still
knows?
kind of work some stuff into there with his hallucinations and other things that were going on, because I'm trying to figure out, did he really see that? No, I think that was a hallucination.
Yeah. Well, and he has to be his job is to be a ghost, right? To be a useful ghost, which is, if he does his job well, nobody knows he's there. And also, I think as a closeted gay man as well, it's like he's a nocturnal creature. He has to work behind the scenes. He has to work quietly. He has to work silently, if he wants any sort of satisfaction sexually, for example.
I don't want to give away too much for people who haven't read it, but I mean, because you bring up hope, and that he found hope in the horror that he read. What about for you? Like, how much hope do you have?
Hope in horror or hope in the world?
Hope in general. Yeah. Hope in the world, hope in life, hope for a good outcome.
It's really bad out there right now, with everything that's going on, in terms of how we treat each other, but also in terms of the climate. And I really, we have 2 4 and 5-year-old nieces, and I really worry for them. But all I can do is hope.
Mm-hmm.
Really. I know that humans are super adaptable, and that's kind of the problem. That's why we're so terrible. But at the same time, we're super adaptable. We might be able to figure it out. I think science fiction writers have, they've seen the future, and they've seen the many ways that we can be living, whether it's on Mars or with water, contained and packaged in a very specific kind of way, or, so
yeah.
The problem is there's going to be so much tragedy leading up to any kinds of solutions. People are going to die. There's going to be devastation of species of the planet. But I think as a writer,
I think that's
my
the
job
question
is to hope.
Yeah, that's the question I want to ask you. Do you write with hope?
I do.
Write with hope? Yeah, that's the sense I got. That's why I wanted to ask you that.
Yeah, I'm always looking for the happy ending. Always looking for the happy ending. And The Sleeping Car Porter, when I first started writing it, it was a real slog, because I thought there's no way there can be a happy ending for a Black gay man in 1929 working in this crappy job. And then a friend of mine said to me, she said, "You're a fiction writer, make it happen." And that was like absolutely freeing, because I thought, you know what, there are ways to get a happy ending. There are ways to find your moments of happiness and satisfaction and joy. It's there. Mm-hmm. It's not what we hear, because I don't know, this is a cliche, but if it bleeds, it leads. That's what we hear. But there are those little pockets of, okay, we're going to make this work, however that might be. Yeah.
I loved your book. I loved your book, and I loved the ending. Yeah. And I think that's the ending of this.
I could have talked for hours. I could have talked for hours and hours and hours about this. So interesting.
Yeah. Oh, you're terrific. We just kind of meandered our way through the whole thing, and I loved it. I love speaking with you, Suzette.
Oh, it was so great to talk with you.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got to tell me what happens with that tinkly house. So if the tinkle is still there, you've got to tell me.
Okay, I'm going to ask her, and I will get in touch with you and let you know. How's that?
Thank you. I love that.
Thank you, Suzette. Suzette Mayr is the award-winning author of 6 novels, including The Sleeping Car Porter, which we just talked about, and that won the Giller Prize in 2022. She's also a professor of English at the University of Calgary. For more information on Suzette's work and her books, please check out our show notes. That is it for today's Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And you can follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Thanks for joining us, and have a scary Halloween.